Hello, I'm Shirley Adams to welcome you to the Sewing Connection Series 17, Program 1. I'm really glad to be back with you again and feel like everything's coming up roses. As you look through the offerings in the fabric store, you want to touch everything, of course. But what initially attracts you? Color. Everyone has favorite colors, and that's going to be the theme of this whole series as we concentrate first on one and then another. I hear from so many viewers that, well, I really don't need any more clothes, but I just love to sew. Well, that says to me that you want to do the fun things, the pretty things, and so do I. We're going to do lots of embellishing, and for starters, consider this jacket I'm wearing. It's boiled wool, which, being a knit, it begins that way, and then it purposely goes awry. Well, you can see that I've done a little bit on this because this is fun, is what it's all about. I initially had no interest in a boiled wool jacket whatsoever until I spotted this color, and I couldn't resist. It very definitely is color that encourages you to buy something and make also those surprise purchases that you really hadn't even anticipated making. Well, we were looking at this type of fabric, a couple of series ago. It was in Series 15. We recycled sweaters there. And so this sample is left over from that show in Series 15. And these were two pieces of wool fabric, knit yardage, sweater knits. And they were cut the same size initially. So this is how it came when I bought it. And after it went through the washer and dryer, this is what resulted. This is what boiled wool is. Now what happens to it is it's fulled in the process, is what it's called. And what fulling means is that if you'd see wool under a microscope, a wool fiber, what it looks like is overlapping scales. And what happens in the washer is you put it in hot water and then you rinse it in cold water, and it agitates somewhat, and it's the combination of that temperature change and the agitation, and this is what makes all those scales kind of lock together and overlap, and this is what happens then. And initially this sweater knit, of course, is very stretchy. Well, there's still some stretch in this boiled wool, but not much. It just doesn't move much at all. It really is condensed. Well, this is what has been done. When I bought this yardage, it had already been fulled. And so what I bought, it was knit in a tubular fashion. It wasn't very wide, only about this wide, and I only had 1.5 yards of it. This was a remnant. So that's not much to make a jacket out of. And I knew right off the bat that I was going to have to supplement it with some other fabric. So I took the whole thing, the whole piece, to a fabric shop to see what would look best with it. Well, what I found was this fabric for the dress that I have underneath. Now it is a higher value, hue, value, intensity, these color terms. Hue is the name of the color, red, yellow, blue, whatever. Value is how dark or how light it is. And intensity is how bright or how dull it is. Well, I have maybe it's the same value, come to think of it, a little bit lighter, but also it is definitely a little more intense, a little more bright, but it blends with it pretty well. When you're blending colors like this and when you really want them to look the same, be sure that you look at them both in natural light outside and also at night in your home, because they're going to look different, and you need to get different lights on it to make sure that you have something that really does go well with it. Initially I was going to put something else with this, and it turned out to be a little too orangey looking in natural light, so be careful about that. Well, after you have that pattern all laid and find that you need more, then you decide where the more is going to be. And it can be any place, of course. You could add a yoke, or you could add a panel here or there, wherever it's needed. What I decided to do was put the front and the back of the jacket on, lay it first, and I'll just take it off to show you more easily. Put it on the table here. You lay it first, and I decided that as I was putting the sleeves right on, let's say this is the fold of the fabric right here, as I was putting the sleeves on them, I could get only about this much of the sleeve, about half of it on, or a part of it on, because I had my front and my back on the rest of it here, and there wasn't much left for the two sleeves, one above the other. So this is when I decided, okay, let's just put that extra right down the center of the sleeve. So from here to here, where you see all the yarns and all the beads, this is what's added. This is the second fabric that I've also made the dress out of. And I decided just to blend them a little better because it stood out too much. It didn't blend as well as I would like it to. And so because of that, this is why I decided to put all those yarns on. Well, you know my famous or maybe infamous stash. I just collect things all over as I travel. And as I looked in it, I thought, oh, this crimped ribbon, that might be nice to bind it with. It might be nice somewhere. It turns out I didn't use it at all because I looked in my yarn drawer and found this variegated yarn. I thought, it looks like it was just meant to go on this. And so this is what I have, the same variegated yarn all over the sleeves and the pockets, just because it was a whole lot of fun and because I couldn't find any buttons to go with it. I made little Peruvian ball buttons to go on here also. And these beads, they're collected from several different parts of the world. They just all happen to be in the same color family, so it works out well. Now, you're also going to have to make a really quick decision when you do this. Are you going to line it or not? Typically, boiled wool jackets are not lined because they depend on the stretch. They're comfortable. You can move in them. But if you are a person who doesn't like to have that wool against you, if it's a little itchy, then you might want to consider lining it. Also, this is very, very warm. And so it feels a little cooler with the lining in when it doesn't have all that fuzzy wool against you. So decide that you're sacrificing the stretch. You're not going to have that. You're stabilizing it a little bit with the lining. I always, though, in a lining, put a pleat down the back, so that lets me move where I want to. You also need to decide, now I'm not going to have any interfacing in this at all. It doesn't need any. It's very firm and it doesn't need interfacing really. But you may have to do some stabilizing on some of these seams. For instance, you better put either a little bit of stay tape of some sort, maybe twill tape, or maybe just a selvage cut off of thin fabric. Put something in that shoulder seam so that it can't stretch out, so that it holds in place, because otherwise it will stretch down over your shoulders eventually. And other than that, it's easy to work with. Really, it's a very easy fabric. You also have to decide which is the right and which is the wrong side. Typically, in boiled wool, they use the wrong side because the texture is a little more interesting on the wrong side than it is on the right side. And so that's what I've used on this. Now you can see from the scraps I have down here, I used every bit of it. This is all I had left. I'm going to show you some seam finishes or some ways of seaming it. But which way you would use depends on the fabric you have. This one, for instance, isn't nearly as thick as this blue one. It's about half the thickness. So you treat them differently. If I would be using this blue, I wouldn't want to, this thick one, I wouldn't want to have seams in it at all. It would be just too heavy. What I would do instead is just butt the two raw edges together, and it's not going to ravel. You don't need to finish them on the serger or zigzag them or anything. It won't ravel. So I would just put those heavy edges together and zigzag them and then cover it with something such as jersey here, or maybe suede or leather, or here I've just done a decorative stitch to join them together so that it looks like one piece of fabric, but that way there is no bulk. It's absolutely flat. This one's thin enough that I can seam it. Well, I'm going to take these things over to the machine and we're just going to do a little work with it, see what we can come up with. Let's see, better get my pin cushion, and that ought to about do it. Okay, I haven't finished this jacket, by the way. Maybe you noticed I only have the beads on one side and not on the other, so I'm going to have to do a little sewing there before I finish. Now, I like to save some of that handwork for when I travel or when there's a good movie on TV or something. I like to save the handwork for then because that's just a good time to do it. It makes the job go very easily and go very fast. Well, for seams, I just have a few scraps here, and you can see maybe that there is some difference. One side is a little more interesting than the other. Here's the wrong side, and that's what I'll use for my right side. So I'm going to put those together. And one way you can do a seam is to just, and you might want to, because this is thick, lighten the pressure on the presser foot. And as you start stitching, you might even want to lighten the tension. So see what happens, see what works out well for you. And I have it set on zigzag right now. I better get back to straight stitch. And probably I will lengthen those stitches because they don't really need to be this small. So, I'll just lengthen them a couple. And this is not scooting at all because I lightened the pressure on the presser foot. It's working out just fine, so I'd leave it alone. Or I'd leave it at that. I don't have to, I see, loosen the tension on the thread at all. What you might do then is just press this open, and that's what I did on the side seams of my jacket because that worked out very well. Here's a side seam, and just by pressing it open it came out very flat, and it worked very nicely that way. But if yours doesn't, if it wants to stand up like this and it won't press flat, of course you'd use a steam iron, use a press cloth, but you could always do something like this because this would be pretty. And you very often see this on those that are done commercially. Maybe it's just a straight stitch they do on either side of the seam. Just do it an equal distance from the seam on each side. Or maybe you want to, if you have princess seams, for instance, coming down through the jacket, which is typical, you may want to instead do some sort of a decorative stitch on one side to hold it flat at the same time you're doing that decorative stitch. So that's a possibility. Another possibility is to offset it, and as I said, this isn't going to ravel, so I'm not going to bother to finish it in any way, but you might want to offset it. Instead of putting those seam edges right together, you might want to make the top one a little bit shorter and do a seam, whatever width you find appropriate for your garment. And after you have this seam sewn with one short side and one long one, then you might want to overlap the long side over the short side. Just smooth it over this way. I'd press it first, and then do a flat felled seam by having this stitching here. And so either do it on the right side or the wrong side. Of course, it'd work a lot easier if you would first do some pressing on it. But this flat felled seam is sometimes used. And this isn't a typical flat felled seam because you don't have to turn under the raw edge on the back side. You can instead just do it like this. But this is where you have the long seam going over the short seam so that it encloses it all. And then if you want to get rid of all the bulk possible, you might even cut it off close to your stitching line and not have that extra there. So that's a possibility. There's no need to do any serging as far as finishing since it won't ravel. But here I've done some serging just to see what this looks like. A couple of choices, there are many choices, but here we have some heavy rayon thread. It's a heavy cord really, kind of a pearl rayon. Here we have something called loonie, and it's actually a wool, a heavy thread. But this can be pretty. Any of these things you might do as a decorative edge if you want to in the serger. And so this I was just doing as a decorative edge, trying these out to see how they'd look. And they would look pretty, but I didn't want to do that because I had some other things that I would prefer to do. What I did over here is just a little bit different because I wanted to use the yarns and the other fabrics. So there are always a lot of choices, and I don't know what I want to do until I try them out on scraps. It's worth taking that little extra time to find out that you really have done this the way that you prefer it to be done. Well, what I really did have fun doing is putting that yarn on the sleeves and around the cuffs because I didn't have enough to make the sleeves as long as they needed to be. So that's why those cuffs are down there at the bottom. And it's using the dress fabric, which is a wool crepe, and just putting that around sideways. So it looks like it belongs there, but especially it does since I did the embellishing on it. Sometimes embellishing is needed, not only just because it's fun, but to make it look complete. Now first what I did was do a little bit of pin tucking right down the center of this sleeve. You can see there are several rows of pin tucks, and they're a little hard to see now maybe because I have a lot of beads on top, but I have about 4 or 5 rows of pin tucking there. So this is one possibility. You might do the whole thing pin tucked, but I stopped after the first few rows since I about that time found this yarn and thought, oh no, that's what I want to do, and put the yarn on instead. Now what that yarn is just stitched on with a very slight zigzag, and what I've used to put that on with is a foot that would hold it in place. I've used a deep groove, here's the label for it, this deep groove pin tuck foot. And the reason for that is I found that deep groove, there are so many feet that'll do the job and you don't know until you try them out, and it wasn't meant for this purpose. But that deep groove, I already had it on the machine as I was doing the pin tucks, and then I just left it on to do this couching of the yarn because it worked so well, because the yarn would just go through that center groove and stay right in place. It wouldn't move. And since it stayed in place, even though I did a slight zigzag, I'll put it back on zigzag here, and I'm just going to do a really small zigzag. It doesn't need to go very wide at all because that groove is going to hold it in place. I'm just going to go down to 0.5. That's really a slight zigzag, just barely there. And as far as the length goes, I'm going to go up to 3.5 because these stitches don't have to be small. And then I'm going to couch this on. And it's just a straight yarn, of course. It's variegated, which makes it interesting, but it is just a straight yarn. And so I have all those little knots that you saw on the sleeve. Well, this is how I did it. I'd stitch for a while and then just stop. So I'm stitching in the needle down position so that every time I stop, that will be held down. The needle will hold the yarn in place. Now you can see it just goes right down. It just tracks it beautifully. And so you can do this with almost a straight stitch. Now part of the reason I'm doing it, and I'm seeing it's pulling a little bit, so I'm also going to put this on manual so that I can decrease the tension on the thread. I'll decrease it to about there because it was pulling a little bit, and sometimes that happens when you're couching something on. So I'll start this again and just hold my hand back here for starters, and you might find that you need to do this taut stitching the whole thing on your machine. Try it both ways to see if it will stay by itself or if you need to do a little taut stitching, holding it out straight so that it won't. Oh, I was going to tie some knots, right? I better do that. I'll come back another row and tie some knots. Okay, those knots I really had fun with. I thought they were neat. It took a lot of time, admittedly, but as you well know about me, I'm not a sew it now, wear it 5 minutes later person. I will take all the time I need in order to make something that I really like. Now, since I'm going to tie knots, I can't have this whole big ball of yarn. I'm going to have to cut it off somewhere and then start it again whenever I run out of yarn. What I usually try to do is estimate how much I'd need for a whole row of it and just pull out a big length of it and go ahead and use it that way. And if I didn't use up the whole thing, then fine, I can use it for something else. There are always uses for yarn. Okay, well what I would do after I came down here a little ways is just stop and tie a knot and then sew over it. So simple as that. And what I found to be useful to get it placed just right is my good old tapestry needle, which I usually put a yarn through just so it doesn't get lost in my drawer here so I can see it easily. But just use that tapestry needle to work it where you want to and get it down as small as you want that knot to be. And then when it looks just the way you want it to look, then go ahead and stitch over it. And I'm going to use the knee lift to get the yarn under there, to get that knot to go under the foot so that it really holds it in place. And keep on stitching just through the knot. And if it doesn't come out exactly in the right place, then stop it again and lift the knee, lift so that the foot goes up, and then go ahead and start it. So you can see this takes a little bit of time to put as many rows on as I did, but it's fun. And I like to vary the spaces because they're more interesting that way instead of saying, well, let's see, every 2 inches I will tie a knot. No, in some places I put these knots just right together real close. Other rows are just sort of stitched without any knots at all because I like the variety there. I think it looks a lot prettier when you have some variety so it doesn't look so, oh, marching all in a line. I like a little more natural look there. Okay, well anyway, every time I'd come to a knot, I'd usually have to lift the knee lift in order to get the knot going under that foot, or else it would just want to slide along. So you can see this is going to take a while, but it's a nice effect, isn't it? And it's different. I like to do things that I haven't seen other places. And what suggests them, why I imagine them, how I think them up, it's just that the materials I use suggest these things. It's just letting your mind free up a little bit, and the magic happens if you just don't try to control it too carefully, too closely. Okay, we just go through that. And at first I was thinking, well, maybe I'll sew beads on at the same time because some beads you can sew on by machine. In this case, I decided finally that no, it's easier to just put the beads on by hand after I was all finished because so many of these beads are so big and chunky that that was the best way to do it. Now something else that I use this yarn for, okay, so you can see how the knots are tied and it does straighten out. And after you get finished, this is the only one, this is before I loosen the tension on the thread. The second one worked just fine once I had it loosened. Now also, once this is all finished and pressed from the back side with a steam iron, then it flattens out beautifully and you won't have any little ripples anywhere, so it'll look a lot nicer. Something else I decided to do though is around the front edge, do some binding because it had to be finished there some way. So what I have is a binding. Now anytime you bind, be sure you cut it on the bias because it's going to go around curves and it won't curve well, and around the neck curve, it won't curve well on the straight. You need it on the bias if it's a woven fabric. So here's what I used for my bias, and this is cut, about an inch and a half and almost 2 inches wide really is what I have here because I wanted kind of a wide binding. And this is just sewing it with the right sides together, a little narrow seam there, and then flip it over to the back side. And because this is just a raw edge, I already had the lining stay stitched to it. And because it's a raw edge, and I had a facing here attached to the lining, but this raw edge of course had to be turned under. And that being the case, I wanted it to stay soft. Usually I would just stitch in the ditch right along there, right where the two fabrics meet. I would straight stitch there to catch the back side. I didn't in this, I did it by hand in order to keep it very soft and supple since there is no interfacing, and I wanted to kind of leave it that way and make it just very nicely soft. What I have also done though is made all this bias and striped it. Instead of leaving it plain, I striped it with this yarn. And the way I did that was to first of all take my fabric, and on the straight of it, I'm just showing you here with this already printed striped fabric, I cut it on the straight, but then when I cut the bias out, or I stitched it on the straight, the yarn stitched on the straight, when I cut out the bias, you can see that it goes like this. Here is how the straight fabric would go, and that is a 45-inch degree, that is bias. Now what I've also done is put these lines on. I drew them on with a pen. It'll be right on the edge of the fabric. It'll never show, so it doesn't matter what you draw them with. But when you stitch this together to make continuous bias, you offset this. And so what that means is that when you put it together, instead of putting it so that it just comes out exactly right, you offset it one row and do the stitching there. And after you have this little seam all stitched along here, just along there, then when you well, why don't I just stitch it? Okay, I don't have the right foot on, but I'll just go ahead and stitch this anyway. And what I wanted to do is to get, just right here where I'm going to be stitching, I wanted to get it matched up just right so that when it's cut, it'll come out nicely. I would probably put a few pins in, and this looks a little funny when you start doing this, but it works out just right once you get going in it, once it stitches, or you start stitching it, and I'll put it back on straight stitch. Once you start stitching it, it really will work out just right because you can work this around as you go, and it's going to be a spiral job. But if you have a lot of bias to cut, this is a good way to do it, to join it all in one piece instead of joining the individual little pieces. Now notice what's happening here. This is being stitched on the straight, which you always want to do when you join bias, because if you would just join it straight across, which would be joining on the bias, then it would be bulky in that place, and you don't want to do that. By stitching this on the straight, then when you start cutting this, when you actually cut the bias, then it'll go round and round, and I'm just going to cut into it here. And you can see as I cut on my lines, I'll get around here in a minute, it will just come out right as I pass by the seam every time, and it'll end up one big long piece of bias. So it's a good deal, and that's what it's bound with. As far as these, the fastening goes, I decided to use these Peruvian ball buttons, and if we have time I'll do these. I'm not sure. What it is though is just a lot of yarn wound around a tube and tied so it comes out in little knots like this, and it makes a pretty button. They may be just here temporarily because if I see some buttons that really go with this, I'll buy them and put them on later. What I have for buttonholes is just a nice tube of bias cut fabric. It is stitched on here by hand, and there's an opening wherever I want a button loop to be. Even though it looks completely straight when it's unbuttoned because I didn't want them jutting out there, I just left it space here and there. I'd come up to here and just knot my thread, go to the other side, and then start stitching by hand until it comes to the next one. And so those make nice button loops to button these little ball buttons. As far as stitching these beads on, you can just stitch them randomly however you want to. And I have a nice assortment of beads here. And very often these beads come on like a necklace. You can wear them as a necklace, in fact. So they come looking like this, and then I just pulled them off that necklace in order to stitch them on. So I have several different varieties, but they were all in the same color family because after all, it's color that turns you on. Now usually Geiger jackets like this or Austrian boiled wool jackets, usually they're cut with princess lines, and here are a couple of them that we see down here, so that's a possibility. I had this scarf that I bought and I have never worn, and I thought, well, look at the kind of green tones in this. This is going to be an opportunity to wear this scarf. Eventually, everything you own comes together and everything matches something else, and this is the beauty of it. Well, this was really a very plain, shapeless jacket, as you can see. But as I said, usually these boiled wool garments are more fitted with princess seams. Well, these curved seams can fall in many places for interesting looks. Here I've made them in the coordinating dress, and this is just a princess line top on it. Well, come join me next time and I'll show you how to create these princess lines.